Hello and welcome back to tonight's journey. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Perhaps it is a quiet evening after a long day, or maybe it is already midnight when the room has softened, the lights have grown gentler, and the world outside has faded into only a few distant sounds. Tonight we will leave the present behind. We will leave behind the streets and the familiar rhythm of daily life to travel back roughly 70 million years to a time when Earth still belonged to giants. This was the late Cretaceous, a damp, ancient world breathing with wildlife. Rivers heavy with silt wound their way across muddy plains. Low forests stretched beneath a wide sky. Dinosaur footprints sank deep into the soft ground. Somewhere in the shade of the trees, predators moved in silence, while the murky water reflected a world that had never known humankind. And in the middle of that world, there was a creature that was not born to run away and not born to hunt. It began life in silence, small and fragile, like every other living being. But as the years passed, its body slowly changed. Its back became covered in bony armor. Its frame grew low, heavy, and solid. Its tail transformed into a weapon that could make even the most fearsome predators think twice. Tonight we will follow the traces of Ankylosaurus from the first moment of life to the time it became a living fortress in the final twilight of the age of dinosaurs. Lie down, relax your shoulders, and let this ancient story slowly carry you into the shadowed forests of 70 million years ago. Let the night carry us far, far back, far beyond every city, every road, every human voice, far beyond even the forests we know today. We are returning to an ancient Earth roughly 70 million years ago, when the ground still trembled beneath the footsteps of giant creatures, and the sky had never yet seen the shadow of humankind. This was the late Cretaceous, in a place that would one day become North America, a damp floodplain stretched beneath a wide sky. The air was heavy with moisture. Slow rivers curved through muddy land, carrying broken branches, fallen leaves, silt, and tiny fragments of life from a vanished world. Along both riverbanks, plants grew thick in dense patches. Low ferns spread their fronds close to the ground. Conifers rose through the thin mist. In some places, the forest opened into muddy clearings. In others, water gathered into shallow pools that reflected the pale gray sky of early morning. The world murmured with the sound of insects' water, running past tree roots and mud sinking beneath the weight of distant footsteps. Every now and then, from beyond the low forest, a deep sound rolled through the air, impossible to tell whether it was a call, a warning, or simply the breath of some large creature passing through. The ground remembered everything through footprints. There were round, deep tracks left by heavy plant eaters. There were long, three-toed prints stretched across the mud, leaving behind the quiet reminder that somewhere among the trees, predators were still moving. Beneath a layer of warm earth, among fallen leaves, dry mud, and a tangle of tiny roots, there lay an egg. It did not glow. It did not move violently. Nothing announced to the world that inside that thin shell, an ancient life was preparing to step outside. The egg simply rested there, silent, as a small stone buried in the warmth of the ground. Like other dinosaurs, Ankylosaurus was born from an egg. Before it became a living fortress, covered in bony armor, before its body grew heavy and solid like a breathing block of stone, it too had begun in this dark place. A small creature lay curled inside the shell, never having seen light, never having known mud, forest, river, water, or the shadow of a predator. A light wind passed through the low vegetation, making the leaves tremble with the faintest sound. Dew gathered along their edges, then fell to the ground in tiny drops. Nearby, an insect crawled across damp bark. Farther away beneath the murky water, an ancient creature stirred gently, sending small rings of ripples outward until they vanished among floating plants. Everything seemed slow, yet nothing was ever truly still. Inside the warm earth, the egg began to change through movements so slight that from the ground above, one would almost never have noticed anything happening at all. Within that thin shell, the tiny body curled in, stretched out, and then lay still again in the darkness that had held it for so long. Everything needed for its first life had already been prepared inside the egg, but at some point, the space that once protected it suddenly became too narrow. The shell that had been a shelter was slowly becoming the first wall the small creature would have to break through in order to enter the world. The hatchling moved again, slower, this time, weaker, but more clearly. It used the awkward motions of its body, perhaps its snout, its head, or the soft weight of its small frame to push against the inner surface of the shell. There was no loud sound, no violent spectacle, only a quiet struggle taking place beneath the damp earth, so small that the vast forest above had no idea it was happening. But for the creature curled inside, this was the first battle of its life. Then the eggshell cracked. A very thin line appeared, spreading gradually across the surface, like a tiny fracture running through a sheet of pale stone. The damp earth around the egg trembled slightly as a small piece of shell broke away, allowing the first breath of the outside world to slip in. That breath carried the scent of fallen leaves, wet mud, river water, somewhere far away, and the mingled smell of life and death inside the ancient forest. The hatchling pushed again, widening the crack. A small part of its head emerged in the darkness beneath the covering of earth, wet, weak, and unfamiliar with everything outside. It did not yet look like a beast. It did not resemble the image that millions of years later humans would rebuild inside museums with an armored back, a low, broad body, and a heavy tail like a weapon. At this moment, it was only a newborn creature, fragile and damp, breathing its first difficult breaths among broken shell and cold earth. Perhaps its eyes could not see clearly right away. Perhaps the light filtering through the layer of fallen leaves above was only a blurred patch without shape or meaning. But its body had already sensed that everything had changed. Before this, the world had been darkness sealed around it. Now the world had air scent, coldness, moisture, tiny vibrations in the soil, and countless sounds existing everywhere at once. A drop of water fell near it. The ground trembled faintly beneath a distant footstep, and then everything settled again, as though the forest had held its breath for a moment. The hatchling lay still among the broken pieces of shell. That silence was not complete peace. It was more like the exhaustion of a creature that had just passed through the first doorway of its life. It did not yet know how to stand firmly, did not know where food could be found, did not know which sounds were safe and which sounds warned of danger. But in that moment, it had done the most important thing. It had left the egg. If we lower our view close to the ground, the world of the late Cretaceous appears enormous in an entirely different way. A falling leaf could seem like a great shelter. A root rising from the mud could look like the trunk of an ancient tree. A small puddle could become a murky lake. Old footprints left by large dinosaurs, dried along the edges, could turn into deep hollows capable of holding rainwater. For a newly hatched creature, everything was too large, too close, and too difficult to understand. It began to move little by little, one front foot pressed into the soft earth, tiny toes searching for support, the young body tilting to one side before stopping as if even its own frame was not yet used to its weight. It tried to lift its head, but the head lowered again. Its breath was thin, its movements still trembling, and the whole body carried the fragile weakness that belongs only to a newborn life. If a grown Ankylosaurus would one day be the image of heaviness, steadiness, and something almost impossible to move, this moment was the image of every beginning, awkward, damp, delicate, and full of uncertainty, and full of... Above the leaves, the morning light began to grow stronger, though it was not the bright light of midday. It was soft, pale, filtered through mist and low branches falling in thin streaks onto the ground. That light touched the broken eggshell, touched the hatchling's back, touched the cold mud, and made the smallness of the creature that had just entered the world even clearer. Somewhere near the nest, there may have been other eggs. Some may have cracked. Some may have remained still. Some other life inside may also have been beginning its own journey. But in nature, not every life is promised a long path, and that is what made this moment both tender and tense. An egg is not only a beginning, it is also a scent that can be discovered. In a crowded ecosystem, where every creature must find a way to eat in order to live, a nest is never an entirely safe place. A small meat eater, an opportunistic reptile, or a passing predator could turn the place of birth into the place of ending. For an adult Ankylosaurus, the world would one day have to learn to keep its distance. But for this hatchling, that distance did not yet exist. It had no fortress yet, no heavy body to defend itself, no strength great enough to make others hesitate. It had only a small body, newly awakened instincts, and a layer of damp earth temporarily helping to hide its scent from the forest. Time moved very slowly. At last, the hatchling managed to pull its body free from the broken shell, but it did not go far, only shifting a few small lengths toward a place where the cover of leaves was thinner and the light could touch its body more clearly. Every movement was awkward, every pause stretched out, as if the body itself was still learning how to belong to this world. A light wind passed over it, making the young skin tremble, and a small piece of eggshell still clinging to its body fell into the mud, quiet, as the first tiny mark in the long story just beginning. Life begins with sensations as small as these. No lesson is spoken. No one explains what it should do. And there is no place truly safe enough for it to understand the world slowly and without fear. The ancient world teaches through pressure, through scent, through the sudden silence of the forest, through faint vibrations traveling through the mud beneath its feet. A hatchling survives not because it understands all of this, but because the instinct inside its body has been passed down through countless generations before it. As the sun rose higher, warmth seeped gradually through the soil. The hatchling moved again this time, lifting its head a little longer. A soft leaf lay nearby its edge, still wet with dew, brushing against its snout, like the faintest invitation from the outside world. It brought its snout closer, uncertain whether this was food or simply some strange obstacle in this new space, and then it tried to bite. It was not yet a true meal, only a first contact with plants, with the green smell, with the damp taste of the things that might one day nourish it for many years, if it was lucky enough to keep living. Around it, the broken eggs slowly fell silent. Pale pieces of shell mixed with mud, the layer of leaves had been disturbed, and a few small marks of movement were pressed into the soft ground, like the faintest writing of a beginning. To us, it is a memorable moment. But to the forest, it is only one part of countless events happening every day, leaves growing and falling, eggs hatching and breaking, hatchlings surviving or disappearing, water rising and retreating, mud remembering and then being covered by another layer of mud. The beauty of the prehistoric world does not lie in its gentleness, but in its truth. It is true in its vastness, in its silence, in the way every living thing must find a path among dangers it cannot name. And this newly hatched Ankylosaurus, however small, has stepped into that current. It was not born in a place of perfect safety, was given no promise that it would grow to adulthood, and did not know that its body, if time allowed, would one day change so completely that it would scarcely resemble the fragile creature of this morning. At the edge of the nest, the light finally touched it more clearly. We can see the body low and small, still soft in its shape, the legs unsteady, the head lowered, the breath still quick. We can see a creature that is not frightening at all, at least not yet. If a small predator passed by, it might see only an easy meal. If a sudden flood swept through, the hatchling could be carried away like a leaf. If the foot of a giant came down too close by accident, the entire story could end before it had truly begun. But nature is not only loss. Nature is also the fragile probability of survival. There are eggs that never hatch, hatchlings that do not pass their first day, but there are also small creatures that find the right patch of shade, the right bush, the right quiet moment to keep living. And perhaps this hatchling on that ancient morning received the small measure of luck. It needed no predator passing through, no rain arriving too soon, no great footstep falling too close, and a low bush just thick enough to hide its tiny body from eyes searching for movement. It remained beneath the leaves as the light above shifted slowly. The heat of the day began to settle over the floodplain, and the sounds of morning thinned, giving way to the heavier rhythm of noon. Water in the muddy pools began to evaporate slightly. The smell of decaying plants grew stronger, and far away, a large creature dragged its body through the brush, snapping a dry branch with one brief sound before everything fell quiet again. The hatchling did not go far, because the first chapter of its life was not a journey across the plain, not an encounter with a predator, and not the awakening of armor or tail. The first chapter was simply birth leaving the egg, learning that the world outside was larger than the darkness it had known lying still, when stillness was needed, and breathing among mud-fallen leaves and nameless sounds. And sometimes, in an ancient world, full of teeth claws, floods, and hunger, simply surviving the first morning is already a victory. As the day drifted slowly onward, the late Cretaceous forest kept its secrets. Pieces of eggshell lay mixed with mud. The small marks of movement began to fade. The dew had vanished from the leaf edges, and the ground grew warmer. Beneath the low trees, a newly hatched creature lay still, so small that the world almost seemed to overlook it. But time, if it is given the chance, can do strange things. Time will grow that body larger, make its soft parts stronger, turn the trembling of early life into slow, heavy footsteps. All of that still lies ahead, far away, like the horizon beyond the low forest. For now, in this first chapter, we remain only with the moment of birth. An egg has broken, a breath has begun, and somewhere in the green, damp shadow of the Cretaceous, a small Ankylosaurus has stepped into the world, not yet knowing that one day the world itself would have to learn to keep its distance. After that first morning, the forest of the late Cretaceous continued to live by its own rhythm. The sun rose higher beyond the low trees, warmth slowly spread across the surface of the mud, and the last drops of dew began to fade from the edges of the leaves. Far away, the water still moved very slowly, carrying fallen leaves, small branches, and cloudy silt. That vast world had no idea that beneath a low bush, among a few broken pieces of eggshell, a young Ankylosaurus had just passed through, the first morning of its life. It was still very small, small enough that a falling leaf could cover almost its entire body, small enough that a root rising from the mud looked like a great obstacle. One day it might become a heavy, low, broad creature, covered in armor and powerful enough to make predators think twice. But for now, it was only a clumsy, fragile hatchling trying to understand what the world outside the egg truly was. Its first steps were not really a journey. They were more like tiny attempts. It placed one front foot onto the soft mud, then slowly pulled its body forward. Its legs were not yet steady, and its frame was still light and weak. So when the ground sank a little too deeply, the hatchling tilted to one side and had to stop. It tried to lift its head, tried to balance, tried to move a little farther. Every movement was slow, but within each movement, life was learning how to stand. For a newly hatched creature, the land around the nest was already an enormous world. A cluster of roots looked like a fence. A small puddle looked like a lake. A patch of open ground between two bushes could feel far too exposed. The hatchling did not go far. It simply followed the places where leaves cast shade, where the mud was not too deep, where its tiny body could blend into the colors of earth-dry leaves and shadow. In nature, survival does not always begin with strength. Sometimes survival is simply knowing when to lie still. The young Ankylosaurus did not yet have a heavy body to protect itself. It did not yet have the firm armor of an adult. It did not yet have a tail powerful enough to make other creatures keep their distance. So the first thing it learned was not how to fight back, but how to hide. When there was a sound in the brush, it lowered its body. When the ground trembled faintly, it stopped. When the light ahead seemed too open, it did not step out right away. These were not clear thoughts, the way humans think. The hatchling did not tell itself that one place was dangerous and another was safe. Its body simply responded in the way instinct had prepared it to respond for a very long time. And those small reactions could help it live through one more day. Noon arrived slowly. The air grew warmer, and the smell of mud and decaying plants became clearer. Beneath the low leaves, the hatchling began to touch the world of plants with its small snout. It brought its snout close to a soft leaf, touched it lightly, and then tried to bite. Perhaps it could not eat very much yet. Perhaps it missed, let go, and tried again with another young shoot nearby. Its first meals were nothing grand. Just a few soft leaves, a few damp stems, a few unfamiliar tastes that its body was slowly learning to know. But for a newborn creature, every small piece of food mattered. Those leaves would become energy to help it stand more firmly, to help its bones grow, to help its skin thicken, to help its body move little by little, away from the weakness of the moment it had first left the shell. A fortress is not built in a single day. It begins with ordinary things like this: a breath, a step, a soft leaf, a peaceful afternoon when no predator happens to pass nearby. Still eating meant moving more. Each time the hatchling raised its head, each time it shifted out of the shade to reach a greener patch of plants, that small body became easier to notice. In the ancient forest, danger did not come only from large predators. To an adult Ankylosaurus, many smaller creatures might not have seemed frightening at all. But to a hatchling, even a small meat-eater, an opportunistic reptile, or a creature searching for eggs and young bodies could become a real threat. And so it ate, then stopped. It moved forward, then lowered itself again. It did not walk straight out toward brighter ground, but slipped around beneath the trees. Sometimes the crack of a dry branch far away was enough to make it freeze for several breaths. Sometimes the sudden thinning of insect sounds made it stay still for longer. The forest did not tell the hatchling what was happening, but the forest was always sending signals. And the young creature learned to listen with its entire body. By afternoon, the light began to change color. It was no longer white and hot the way it had been at midday, but slanted down in thin golden streaks across the mud. Small pools reflected the pale sky. Insects flew lower. The wind carried the smell of river water, damp leaves, and sometimes a strange scent from far away. The hatchling lay in the shade, its body less wet than it had been that morning, a few patches of dry mud clinging lightly to its legs and belly. It had moved only a short distance, but to the hatchling, every small stretch of ground was part of its first lesson in life. It had learned that mud could sink. Leaves could hide a body. Open light was not always a place to step into. A distant sound did not always need to be understood. Sometimes it only needed to make the body stop. And most important of all, it was learning that the world outside the egg was not only vast, but always changing. When the first day began to close, the forest did not become kinder. It only became darker. Shadows stretched longer, the bright places on the ground grew narrower, and the sounds inside the brush began to feel closer. During the day, the steady chorus of insects and flowing water made everything seem familiar. But when dusk settled, in every rustle of leaves, every faint movement in the mud, every branch cracking somewhere far away, could make the young Ankylosaurus startle. The first night outside the egg was probably not a deep sleep. It curled beneath the low leaves, drifting through brief moments of rest. A drop of water falling into the mud could wake it. A small animal crawling near the roots could make it remain still for longer. Far away at times, the ground trembled very slightly, as if a large creature were moving somewhere in the darkness. The hatchling could not see that creature, and it did not understand what it was, but its body understood one simple thing. It was not time to move. Many young creatures in that ancient world likely never survived nights like this. Nature does not distinguish between the creature that will become powerful in the future and the creature that will disappear while still very small. A scent discovered too soon, a footstep falling too close, an unexpected rainstorm, or a small stream of water spilling across the nest could end a story that had only just begun. But sometimes, with a bush low enough, a night quiet enough, and an instinct that knows when to remain still, life can continue. And then the second dawn came. It arrived very gently, with pale gray light, spreading through the mist, with moisture gathering on the leaves, with the sound of insects returning in the brush. The young Ankylosaurus was still there. It lay in the shade that had sheltered it through the night, its body covered with a little dry mud, its breathing lighter and more even. It did not know it had just survived its first night. But its body had gained a small experience. The darkness outside the egg was more frightening than the darkness inside it. Yet, if it stayed still, if it chose the right place, it could pass through. On the second day, its steps were still awkward, but a little less strange. When its feet touched the mud, it balanced better. When it met a small root, it changed direction sooner. When it heard an unfamiliar sound, it stopped more quickly. No one taught it these things. There were no instructions in the ancient forest. But every hour of survival left a mark inside its body, allowing it to understand the world in a very quiet way. It began to move along the edge of the bushes, leaving the old nest little by little. The scent of eggshells still lingered behind it, but it had begun to fade. Ahead were lower patches of plants, a few softer leaves, and a damper stretch of ground near a small pool. To a large creature, that distance would have meant almost nothing. But to the hatchling, every span of open earth was as long as a road. It moved slowly, stopped often, and always searched for a place where it could hide if an unexpected sound came. From its low height, the world was still enormous. Fern leaves hung down like arches. Old footprints left by large dinosaurs had become deep hollows filled with water. Some were dry along the edges, others were still soft and slippery. A footprint like that was only the trace of another creature passing by, but to the hatchling it could become a mud trap, a pool too difficult to cross, or a place that had to be avoided. Everything in the forest could be both shelter and obstacle. Sometimes from far away, the sound of a herd of large plant-eaters passed through the trees. There was no need to see them to feel their presence. It was enough to hear leaves being pushed aside, mud being pressed down water in small pools, trembling in waves. The hatchling lay still as those vibrations reached it. Those large creatures may not have hunted it. They may not even have known it existed. But for a body, this small danger did not come only from teeth and claws. Danger could also come from a careless footstep. Day after day, the young creature learned to conserve itself. It did not run unless it needed to. It did not leave the shade for too long. It ate near places where it could hide. It lay low when the wind carried an unfamiliar scent. These reactions were the first stones of the future fortress, built not from bony armor or strength, but from the habit of survival. Before the body could become large enough to defend itself, it had to stay alive long enough for that body to grow. Gradually, it became less like the creature that had just climbed out of the eggshell. Its legs grew a little steadier. Its head lifted for longer. Its snout found leaves with more accuracy. Its breath was no longer as quick as it had been in those first hours. The change was slow, so slow, that if one watched it day by day, it would almost be impossible to notice. But nature often builds the things that last in exactly this way, little by little, through mud, through water, through small meals, and through nights without being found. Still, fragility remained. If this hatchling were placed beside the image of a full-grown Ankylosaurus, the distance between the two would seem almost impossible to believe. On one side, a small creature hidden among fallen leaves. On the other, a low, broad, heavy body covered in armor, formidable enough to make a predator think carefully. But no fortress appears on the first morning. Before the armor, before the weight, before the shape that would make the world keep its distance, there are always fragile days like these. One afternoon, the hatchling moved farther than usual to reach a patch of greener young plants at the edge of damp ground. The leaves there were softer, the green smell stronger, but the patch of land was more exposed. It lowered its head and ate a little at a time. Then the wind shifted, carrying an unfamiliar scent, drier and heavier, unlike the smell of leaves or mud. The hatchling stopped at once. No predator appeared. There was no chase. The forest simply grew a little quieter. From far away came the sound of a dry branch cracking, then leaves shifting softly, and then everything returned to its usual rhythm. Perhaps it was only a creature passing by. Perhaps it was a real danger. The hatchling did not need to know for certain. It returned to the shade with slower steps, as if its body had just learned something important. Better food was not always worth the price of safety. That lesson would stay with it for a long time. A powerful defensive animal does not survive by rushing into every danger. It survives by understanding that many confrontations do not need to happen at all, even while still young. In those moments of stopping, the shape of a slow living creature had already begun to appear. When night settled once more over the ancient floodplain, the young Ankylosaurus lay among fallen leaves and breathed softly in the dark. Above, cold and distant stars shone down on a world that had not yet been given human names. Beneath them, in the small shadowed place, it had chosen a fragile creature continued to live. It was not yet a fortress. It had not yet made any predator step back, but it had taken its first steps. And in a world where so many stories end before they truly begin, that alone was enough to be a kind of miracle. Tomorrow morning, it would wake again in the damp air of the low forest. It would search again for soft leaves, step again through mud, and listen again to nearby and distant sounds it did not yet understand. It would need many more days like this, many more nights like this, many more nameless moments of fear before its body began to offer it greater protection. But from here, the journey had moved beyond the moment of birth and into something harder, learning how to grow. And in each small footprint, pressed into the soil of the late Cretaceous, the faint shape of a future fortress was slowly being built by time, mud instinct, and survival. Time in the forest of the late Cretaceous did not pass in a hurry. It was not marked by days and dates in the way humans would later understand them, but by rains that came and went, by mud drying beneath the sun, by new shoots rising along the water's edge, and by old footprints slowly fading beneath soft layers of earth. For the young Ankylosaurus, every morning when light returned was another chance the world had given it to grow. It was no longer the creature that had just crawled out of the eggshell. Its body was still small compared with the adult dinosaurs that moved across the floodplain, but compared with that first morning, it had already changed in many ways. Its legs were steadier. Its head could stay lifted for longer. Its snout had learned to seek out soft leaves instead of touching everything with the uncertain curiosity of a newborn. It was still slow, still cautious, still able to disappear easily among fallen leaves and dark mud. But there was now a trace of familiarity in each movement, as if that small body was gradually learning the paths of its own life in a vast world. Its days often began while dew still clung to the edges of leaves. At that hour, the forest was gentler. The air was cool, the mud soft, and the sounds lighter than they would be once the sun climbed higher. The young Ankylosaurus moved along the edge of low bushes where leaves growing close to the ground formed a tangled roof above it. It lowered its head, searching for young shoots, soft leaves, and pieces of damp vegetation. It ate slowly, without greed, stopping every so often, as if listening to whether the forest had changed. At this age, its world had grown wider than the old nest, but not so wide that it could go anywhere it wanted. It began to have familiar paths. One path curved around a large cluster of roots where the mud was often soft and easy to sink into. Another followed a fallen trunk where shade kept the ground cooler for longer. There was a low area near a pool of water where young leaves grew thickly, but where many other creatures had left their tracks as well. The young Ankylosaurus did not understand these paths through thought in the way a human would, but its body remembered them. Places where its feet had once been caught, it avoided. Places where an unfamiliar scent had drifted through the wind, it moved more slowly. Places where shade was thick and soft leaves were close, it returned to again and again. Mud was almost always present in its life. Mud clung to its feet, stuck to its belly, dried into thin patches, then flaked away when it brushed against low bushes. Mud held the footprints of large creatures, held water, after rain held the smell of fallen leaves and whatever had passed before. Sometimes the mud was so soft that every step had to be pulled free slowly. Sometimes the surface dried and cracked into thin lines beneath the sun, making walking easier, but also leaving clearer traces behind. For a growing creature, mud was both an obstacle and the quiet map of the forest. On that muddy ground, it began to encounter more footprints. There were round, deep tracks left by large plant eaters pressed into the earth like small water-filled pits. There were long marks where a tail or fallen trunk had dragged across the ground. There were sharper, longer three-toed prints with the claw marks pressed clearly into the front. Those footprints needed no roar to make the forest feel different. The young Ankylosaurus only had to see them or smell the strange scent still lingering nearby, and it could stop for a very long time. It did not know how to call them predators. It did not know the names of the creatures that had left those tracks. But its body understood that some marks in the earth were not like others. The footprints of a large plant eater often moved in groups heavy and spread out, leaving behind the smell of crushed leaves and disturbed soil. The three-toed prints of a predator were often fewer, lighter, in a more tense and deliberate way, as though the creature had crossed the mud not to find leaves, but to find something that was breathing. One morning, while mist still lay thick over the low ground, the young Ankylosaurus came near a familiar pool. It had drunk there before. It had found soft shoots growing around the muddy edge. But on that morning, just before stepping out from the bushes, it stopped. In the damp ground near the water were fresh tracks. They had not yet been blurred by water. Their edges were still sharp, and the claw marks pressed deeper at the front of the toes. The scent around them was different, too heavy and strange, mixed with the smell of churned mud. The hatchling stood still beneath the leaves, head low. It did not run. It simply did not take another step. The pool was still there. The young plants were still green. But something in its body knew that this place was no longer the same as it had been yesterday. A little while later, from far away came the cry of an ancient bird, or perhaps some small creature, and then the sound stopped abruptly. The wind passed very lightly. The water in the pool trembled. The young Ankylosaurus turned its head and slowly followed another path, moving deeper into the low vegetation. Perhaps the danger had already gone far away. Perhaps it had never been close at all. But in a world like this, sometimes avoiding a place was the wisest choice. Its lessons did not come through words. They came through scent, through footprints, through the times it escaped from a place where it should not have remained. Every day of survival taught it a little more. When the insects in the brush suddenly grew silent for too long, it lowered itself close to the ground. When a herd of large plant eaters moved in the distance, it avoided the wide, muddy paths where giant feet could crush anything small by accident. When river water rose after rain, it did not come too close to the bank because the mud there was softer, more slippery, and more likely to hold its feet. It learned slowly, but the forest did not need it to learn quickly. It only needed to learn enough to pass into the next day. Its body grew in a very quiet way. There was no single clear moment when one could say that from this day forward it was different. It was only that after many mornings it no longer had to pause as often before crossing a route. After many nights it no longer trembled at every falling leaf. After many small meals, its body grew a little heavier, its neck a little stronger, and the harder parts of its skin slowly became more noticeable beneath the dried mud. It was still not the living fortress the future would create, but the first stones had been placed silently and slowly through each season of plants growing and falling away. Its forest was not a sealed, dense jungle like the forests we might imagine today. In some places, the trees grew thick and low. In others, the land opened into muddy flats along the river. Here, water gathered into shallow pools. There, the ground rose higher and became drier. Each place carried a different scent. The land near water smelled of wet mud and soft vegetation. Areas thick with fallen leaves smelled sweet, heavy, and slightly dark. Open ground held more light and lower plants, but it also made every creature easier to see. The young Ankylosaurus began to understand that the place with the most food was not always the safest place to be. There were rainy days. Rain in that world arrived slowly, then grew heavier, tapping against leaves, softening the mud, and turning old footprints into cloudy pools. The young Ankylosaurus would lie beneath a low canopy, letting water run along its back and down both sides of its body. It did not understand rain, but its body knew how to wait. After rain, the forest changed. Old scents were washed away and new ones rose up. Familiar paths became more slippery. Low places could fill with water. But tender young plants also grew softer along the muddy edges, and when the sun returned, food became easier to find. After rain, footprints also became clearer. One morning, the young Ankylosaurus crossed a low, muddy flat and saw large tracks pressed over older ones. Heavy, round, deep tracks left by plant eaters. Sharper, three-toed prints crossing one edge of the flat. Those overlapping marks were like a story the ground had told in silence. One creature had passed here before dawn. Another had followed or crossed through afterward. Perhaps no hunt had happened at all. Perhaps these were only the chance intersections of separate lives. But for the young Ankylosaurus, that muddy flat was not a place to remain for long. It circled around the edge of the flat, where a strip of low vegetation helped hide its body. There it found a few soft bushes growing near a fallen trunk. It lowered its head and ate slowly, quietly. From time to time, it lifted its head not high, only enough to feel the wind and the sounds around it. At one moment, an insect landed on the mud-streaked skin and then flew away. At another, a drop of water fell from a leaf onto its head, making it pause for an instant. Then, when everything remained normal, it lowered its head again and continued eating. That was most of its life, small things repeating again and again. Eating, stopping, listening, stepping through mud, avoiding open ground, finding shade, resting, then eating again. If told too quickly, those days might seem as though nothing was happening. But in nature, growing is the great thing that is happening. Every day without being discovered. Every night without being swept away by water. Every time an unfamiliar footprint was avoided. Every meal that made the body a little stronger. All of it helped carry the young Ankylosaurus farther away from the fragility of its earliest hours. As it grew larger, the range of its movement also widened. It no longer stayed only near the place where it had hatched, but began to follow strips of low vegetation connecting muddy ground to slightly higher land. It still did not move quickly. Slowness seemed to have become a part of it. But this was not simply weakness. It moved slowly in order to feel, slowly in order to choose where to place its feet, slowly enough to stop in time when something unusual appeared. A creature living in a world full of traces must learn to read the ground in its own way. One afternoon, it passed through a place that only a few days earlier had been covered in low leaves. Now, many of the plants had been trampled flat. The mud had been churned. A few broken trunks leaned across the ground, and in the soil were footprints larger and deeper than any it had seen nearby before. Beside those large marks ran a line of three-toed tracks, not fresh, but still recognizable. The young Ankylosaurus stopped at the edge of the disturbed area. It did not know what had happened there. Perhaps many creatures had simply passed through at different times. Perhaps there had been a chase. Perhaps the ground had once trembled beneath the panic of a large plant eater. But the lesson left behind was simple. There are places where the forest has been disturbed, and such places are not meant for a young animal to linger in. It stepped back into the shade and went around. No violent sound followed. No predator leapt out. But the calm after those traces made the scene feel even deeper. In the ancient world, danger did not always appear directly in front of the eyes. Sometimes it left only footprints, broken branches, unfamiliar scent, and a silence that lasted too long after an event the hatchling had not witnessed. That evening, it found a resting place beneath lower trees where the ground was slightly higher and less muddy. The wind carried the smell of water from far away. The forest gradually grew cooler. The young Ankylosaurus lay down, belly touching the earth legs, tucked close to its body. It had gone farther than in its earliest days. It had seen more footprints, smelled more scents, and learned more paths around danger. It was still small before the vastness of the world, but it was no longer as helpless as it had been when it first left the shell. In the sky, the last light of day faded slowly beyond the trees. The sounds of night began to rise steady and distant. The hatchling breathed softly. Each breath seemed to mingle with the smell of mud, fallen leaves, water, and the ancient forest. If we looked at it, then we would not see a monster. We would see a growing creature, a small body, trying to live one more day in a world that was never truly peaceful. And perhaps that is what makes its journey worth remembering. Not because it won a great battle, not because it confronted a predator, but because it continued living among countless signs of danger. It grew by learning where to go and where to avoid, when to lower its head, and eat when to lie still, and when to return to the shade. Little by little, mud-low forest and predator footprints became its silent teachers. Many more seasons would still pass. Its body would continue to grow heavier. Its footprints would press deeper into the earth. Its familiar paths would expand with age. But at the end of this chapter, it was still not a complete fortress. It was only a young Ankylosaurus learning how to grow slowly and patiently in an ancient world filled with mud leaves, water shade, and the footprints it always had to remember in order to survive. When night covered the late Cretaceous floodplain, the young Ankylosaurus lay still beneath the low trees. Far away, a heavy sound rose and then dissolved into the darkness. It did not move. It only breathed slow and steady, as it had learned to do through many days of survival. And in that quiet, its small body continued to grow little by little beneath the very slow hand of time. Time continued to move across the floodplains of the late Cretaceous at a very slow rhythm. Rainy seasons softened the mud, then passed away. Dry seasons left the ground lightly cracked beneath the sun. Young leaves grew along the water's edge, then aged fell and mixed into the dark soil beneath the forest. And within that flow of time, the young Ankylosaurus was quietly changing as well. The change came very slowly, so slowly that if one watched only a single moment, it would almost be impossible to notice. But looking back after many seasons had passed, the small body that once lay hidden among fallen leaves had clearly become different. Its body was low for its length, but broader and sturdier. Its legs no longer trembled as much when it crossed the mud. Its neck was steadier when it lowered its head to feed. And along its back, the hard parts that had once been young and faint were beginning to show more clearly beneath thickening skin and dried mud. It was still a plant eater. Every day it still searched for low leaves, young shoots, and soft vegetation close to the ground. It did not hunt anything. It had not been born to chase prey. But nature does not only give weapons to predators. Sometimes nature also places weapons on the bodies of creatures that only want to eat in peace, rest, and survive through one more season. For Ankylosaurus, that weapon did not begin with a roar or sharp teeth. It began with the increasing weight of the body, with thicker skin, with small bony plates beneath the skin, creating a growing sense of hardness whenever it brushed against roots, loose stones, or fallen trunks. With a low stance close to the ground, making the body look like a living mass, anchored firmly into the mud. Everything about it gradually became a quiet reminder harming this creature would not be easy. When it was younger, it had survived by hiding. It lay low when there was a sound. It returned to the shade when the wind carried an unfamiliar scent. It avoided muddy flats where fresh three-toed footprints had been left behind. But as the body grew larger, the world began to treat it differently as well. The small creatures that might once have been dangerous in its earliest days could no longer turn it easily into prey. Not because it had become more aggressive, but because it had become heavier, stronger, harder to drag away, and because its body was beginning to develop places that a hurried bite could not easily pierce. Even so, it was still not a complete fortress. We should see it as a creature between two stages. It was no longer the weak hatchling that had just left the eggshell, but it was not yet a full-grown Ankylosaurus that could make a large predator think for a very long time. It was at the age when the body was beginning to speak on behalf of instinct. Before, whenever danger appeared, the first response had been to move away. Now there were still times when it avoided danger, but if avoidance was no longer possible, the body had gained another way to answer. The most noticeable change lay at the rear of the body. At this stage, if we looked more closely, we would see a creature gradually losing the softness of childhood. Its body was not tall, but it had widened and grown firmer, as though the earth itself were slowly pulling it lower, turning it into a heavy mass, clinging tightly to the mud. The back was no longer smooth and soft, as it had been in the first days. It was beginning to show hard plates beneath the skin, rising in low, rough lines mixed with dried mud and the dust of fallen leaves. Whenever light slanted through the trees, the back did not shine, and it was not beautiful in a gentle way. It carried the rugged look of stone, of bark, of a creature made to withstand impact. Its head had also become sturdier. The snout still lowered toward the ground to search for soft leaves, but the skull had grown broader, the neck thicker, so that every time it lifted its head, the movement felt slow and solid. The forelegs were not long, and they had not been made for speed, but they stood firmly beneath the increasingly heavy body like four short stakes driven into damp earth. When it walked, the mud no longer trembled only lightly as before. It sank more clearly beneath each foot. It did not need to be tall in order to leave an impression. Its strength lay in being low, wide, heavy, and difficult to move. And behind that body, the tail was gradually becoming the most striking part. It was no longer the small tail that had dragged behind it when it first hatched. It had become longer, heavier, and every time the young Ankylosaurus turned, that tail pulled across the ground with a clear weight and inertia. Low grass was pushed aside. Dry leaves were stirred up. Mud was left with a slow, dragging mark behind it. The tail was not yet the fully formed weapon of an adult, but it was no longer harmless. It was like a warning being written gradually into the body. This creature was not born to attack first, but if forced to the end of its choices, it would no longer only know how to hide. The tail that had once been only a small part helping it keep balance was now longer, heavier, and very different in feeling when the body turned. Each time the young Ankylosaurus changed direction, the tail carried a slow, solid force behind it. When it moved through low bushes, the tail could brush against dry stems and shake loose bits of leaves. When it crossed the mud, the rear of the body no longer felt as awkward as before, but had begun to carry its own weight, as though time were quietly placing a kind of strength there that had not yet fully awakened. It did not understand the tail as a weapon. It did not stop to admire its own body, and it had no idea that one day humans would call the end of the tail in its relatives one of the most remarkable defensive structures in the dinosaur world. For the young Ankylosaurus, everything was simply sensation. The heavier feeling when it turned the awkward drag, when it moved through brush, the need for the whole body to coordinate more carefully in order not to lose balance. But from those very sensations, a new kind of self-defense was slowly beginning to form. One morning after rain, while the mud was still soft and the air still rich with the smell of water, the young Ankylosaurus moved along the edge of a low stretch of ground. The night rain had blurred many older footprints, but it had also left soft green shoots around the water's edge. It lowered its head and ate slowly. Each time it pulled at a leaf, the mud beneath its feet sank slightly. Behind it, the tail lay heavy on the damp ground, shifting from time to time with the rhythm of the body. The forest seemed quiet then. Not absolutely quiet, but quiet in the familiar way of a morning after rain. There was the sound of water dripping from leaves. There was the sound of insects beginning to return. There was the faint movement of soft mud beneath the feet of small, unseen creatures. The young Ankylosaurus continued to feed, but it did not forget to stop after a few moments. That habit had followed it from its earliest days: eat a little, listen a little, and only then eat again. The wind changed direction very slightly. It brought another scent, unclear, but strong enough to make the animal stop. The low head lifted just a little. Not far behind, within dense vegetation, something moved. Leaves trembled. Mud made a faint sound. Some creature was passing through, not as large as the giants that left deep tracks across the flats, but not as small as insects or tiny lizards either. Perhaps it was only searching for food. Perhaps it had only wandered close by accident. But in the world of a young Ankylosaurus, every uncertain movement deserved attention. Before this, it might have pressed itself low and waited until the unfamiliar scent disappeared. But on that morning, the ground around it was fairly open. The nearest bush was not close enough to retreat into immediately. The mud beneath its feet was also too soft for quick running, and in truth, it had never been a creature born to run. So it did what its growing body had been preparing it to do. For a long time, it turned. The movement was slow, not graceful, but certain. It did not turn its back and flee. It did not rush toward the strange scent either. It simply rotated its broad body, placing the rear of itself toward the sound, lowering its head a little more, and keeping its feet firmly set in the mud. The heavy tail moved with it, dragging across the wet ground in a long mark. In that moment, the young Ankylosaurus was no longer only a creature that knew how to hide. Its body was beginning to become a boundary. The leaves in the bush trembled again. Perhaps the other creature moved a few steps closer, then stopped. We do not need to see it clearly. We do not need to name it. What matters is not what it was, but that the distance between it and the young Ankylosaurus had changed. In front of it was no longer a hatchling that could easily be pulled away from the shade. In front of it was a low, broad body growing stronger with a heavy tail behind it, like a warning that had not yet made a sound. The young Ankylosaurus swung its tail. It was not yet the perfect strike of a full-grown adult. It may have been awkward, heavy, slightly off balance, and perhaps it only swept through the air and the low grass behind it. But the sound of the tail pulling through the mud, the sound of leaves being struck, the trembling of a slender stem was enough to change the space around it. The creature in the bush froze. A little while later, the leaves trembled backward instead of forward. The unfamiliar scent began to fade. No real battle took place. There was no blood, no roar, no chase. There was only a very small moment in which the body of the young Ankylosaurus spoke on its behalf, "Do not come any closer." It stood still for a little longer. Its breathing was slow. The mud was cold around its feet. The wind passed through the low vegetation. When the forest returned to its ordinary sounds, it finally lowered its head. But it did not eat immediately. Perhaps the body was still holding the feeling of that turn, the feeling of the heavy tail dragging across the ground, the feeling of the muscles along the hips and back working together to create a movement stronger than any movement it had used when it was younger. From that day on, it did not become an aggressive creature. It did not go looking for danger in order to test itself. A plant eater does not need to become a fighter in order to survive. But its body had learned another way to respond. If the distance was still wide enough, it would avoid. If shade was close, it would move back into it. But if pressed into open ground, if an unfamiliar scent came too close, if there was no easy way to retreat, it could turn its body lower itself and make the rear of its body something that another creature would have to consider. The larger it grew, the less it resembled a creature that could be lifted, dragged away, or attacked with ease. The body widened, making it harder to roll over or bite into the softer parts. The back became harder beneath the skin and dried mud. The protective structures across the body became clearer, as though the ancient earth had sent small pieces of stone into its flesh. The head still lowered to feed on low leaves, but the neck and shoulders had grown stronger. The legs were short, but solid, gripping the ground like living stakes. There were afternoons when it crossed muddy ground near the forest edge, and the slanting light made its back appear as a low, dark line. No longer the trembling shape of a newly hatched creature, and not yet the massive armored form of full adulthood, it looked like a structure being built by nature itself. Every thickening layer of skin, every strengthening piece of bone, every habit of turning when it heard something behind it was another small stone placed into that structure. From time to time, it still passed three-toed footprints pressed into the mud. They reminded it that predators were still somewhere in this world. Some tracks were old with water collected in their centers. Others were newer, their edges still sharp enough to make the young Ankylosaurus change direction. Its body was stronger than before, but the instinct for caution had not disappeared. True strength in nature is not always standing your ground. Many times, strength is knowing when not to test your luck. And so the young Ankylosaurus still lived slowly. It ate in the shade when it could. It chose firm ground instead of deep mud. It rested where its back could blend into the colors of plants and earth. But each time it had to step into open ground, It was no longer entirely the same as before. If an unusual sound came, it did not only lie still, it turned its body more effectively. It held its feet more firmly. Its tail moved with greater weight. The body had begun to develop a voice of its own. Another day, when the sun was low and the forest had begun to darken, it passed beside a fallen trunk in search of soft leaves. There, a smaller creature was rummaging through the layer of fallen leaves. When it heard the heavy steps of the young Ankylosaurus, the creature stopped and slipped away very quickly. There was no confrontation. There was no clear danger. But that retreat said something about what the body of Ankylosaurus was becoming. It was no longer something easily ignored or easily tested. It had begun to carry weight within the forest. That weight was not only a matter of mass, it was in the low stance, in the calmness, in the way the animal did not panic at a sound, but stopped, turned, and kept its distance. It was in the fact that smaller creatures sometimes chose to leave before anything happened at all. This was a very quiet kind of power, needing no roar, no speed, no sharp teeth. A kind of power born from defense. Night came down over the floodplain. The young Ankylosaurus found a familiar place beneath low trees. The mud there was a little drier, carrying the smell of fallen leaves, and a leaning trunk blocked some of the wind. It lay down slowly, settling its body close to the ground. The heavy tail rested behind it, no longer the small body part of the earliest days, but a clear presence. Not a weapon that always had to be used, but a weapon whose mere existence changed the way the world approached. In the darkness, the sounds of night began to rise. Far away water flowed. Closer by insects called, and leaves brushed softly against one another. At times a heavy sound rose from the distant forest, then faded away. The young Ankylosaurus did not move. It only breathed slow and steady. Its body lay still beneath the leaves, but inside time continued doing its work. Tomorrow it would wake again, eat again, step through mud again, read old footprints again, and listen to the wind. It would still have to grow much more before becoming the true fortress of this land. But from the moment its body learned to turn toward danger, from the moment the heavy tail began to become a warning, its journey had crossed into a new threshold. It was still a quiet plant eater of the low forest. It still needed soft leaves, water shade, and safe paths. But now within each slow step, something different had appeared. A certainty, a boundary, a message that did not need to be spoken. Do not come too close. And in the world of the late Cretaceous, where many creatures lived, by chasing, biting, or fleeing, the young Ankylosaurus was learning a very different way to exist, not hunting, not showing off, not rushing, but simply allowing its own body to become a weapon that protected the life inside. Dawn came very slowly over the floodplains of the late Cretaceous. Before the sun rose above the low line of trees, the darkness had already begun to fade, layer by layer, revealing the cold surface of the mud leaves, wet with dew, trunks leaning down toward the water's edge, and small pools left behind after the night's rain. The air at that hour was soft and damp, as though the entire ancient world were still breathing in deep sleep. Beneath a cluster of low trees among fallen leaves and ground that was a little drier, the young Ankylosaurus lay still in the shade. After many seasons of survival, that body was very different from the tiny creature that had once emerged from the eggshell. It was low, broad, and stronger. Its back rose in rough shapes formed by hard plates beneath the skin, covered with dried mud and leaf dust like an earth-colored coat. Its forelegs were short but steady, planted into the muddy ground, with the slow assurance of a species born not to run, but to stand firm when necessary. The waking of a heavy creature is never hurried. First came a deeper breath, then the broad head slowly lifted. A few pieces of dry leaves slipped from its back. The tail shifted lightly behind it, dragging across the ground in a short mark. The young Ankylosaurus remained lying there for a little longer, quietly listening to the morning. In a world like this, opening one's eyes never meant standing up at once. Before stepping out from the shelter of the trees, the armored creature had to let the forest speak first. And the early forest spoke in very small sounds. Water seeped through roots. Insects began to hum inside the low brush. A drop of dew fell onto a leaf rolled along its veins and touched the mud below. Farther away, there may have been the footsteps of a herd of plant-eaters moving along the river's edge, but the sound was still faint, not close enough to tighten the air. After a few moments of listening, the Ankylosaurus pushed itself up on its legs and slowly carried its heavy body away from its resting place. A new day began with the search for food. Around the resting place were low bushes, a few clusters of ferns, and several young shoots that had risen after the rain. The broad head lowered close to the ground, the snout brushing softly against tender leaves. There was no violent tearing, no branches snapping flat, no haste. The meal unfolded slowly, almost silently. The Ankylosaurus pulled at the softer parts of the plants, chewed steadily, then took another small step to find the next patch of leaves. Meals like this took up much of the life of this armored dinosaur. With a body that grew heavier over time, food was not a minor matter. It was the reason those legs had to move through mud each day. It was the reason the snout had to search among low-growing plants. It was the reason this plant-eater had to remember where tender shoots appeared after rain, where the ground near water was useful but too dangerous, and where the shade was thick enough to eat and remain hidden at the same time. Each small leaf entered the body, feeding bone, feeding muscle, feeding the armor that was slowly being completed by time. As the sun climbed higher, light began to touch the Ankylosaurus's back in pale patches. The armored parts of the body were not polished or beautiful like metal. They were rough, rugged, mixed with dried mud and the color of fallen leaves. From a distance, the creature looked almost more like a moving mound of earth than an animal. That appearance allowed the low, broad body to blend into the forest, into tree roots, into the dark streaks of mud still lying beneath the shade. In the natural world, sometimes not standing out is also a way to survive. After the first meal, the Ankylosaurus began moving toward the low ground near the water. Each step left a clear print in the mud. Water seeped into the new footprints, forming shallow hollows that glimmered in the morning light. The path was not straight. The armored creature moved along the bushes, circled around places where the mud was too soft, avoided deeper pools, and chose firmer ground whenever possible. A heavy body could not afford to become trapped through carelessness. For this animal, choosing a path was just as important as finding food. Near the water's edge, the plants grew softer. Silty mud held moisture, allowing tender young leaves to rise in low patches. It was a good place to feed, but it was also a place where many other species came. Water always draws life together, and where life gathers danger is often not far away. For that reason, the Ankylosaurus did not walk straight out into the open. The heavy body stopped at the edge of the shade, head lowered back still beneath its layer of dried mud. Wind blew in from the river, carrying the smell of murky water, crushed plants, wet mud, and a few faded, unfamiliar scents. There was no signal too close. The insects still called steadily. The water's surface trembled only slightly in the breeze. After a while, the armored creature stepped forward, lowered its head to the soft plants along the water's edge, and began to eat. The second meal of the day was as quiet as the first. Each time the snout pulled through the leaves, a few drops of water fell into the mud. Each slow movement of the jaw made the thick neck shift gently beneath the skin. Insects flew around the back, landed on the armored plates, then flew away again. A leaf fell onto the water, drifted a short distance, and became caught among the roots. Nothing in the scene was dramatic, but that very ordinariness was the truest part of life for a plant-eating dinosaur. From time to time, the Ankylosaurus lowered its head to drink. The snout touched the murky surface, sending small rings across the water before they faded away. Drinking water was a simple act, but not an entirely careless one. When the head lowered, the field of view narrowed. When the body stood still for too long at the water's edge, attention had to be shared in many directions. So after each drink, the heavy creature often raised its head and stood still for a few moments, letting the wind, the sounds, and the ground tell the rest of the morning's story. By midday, heat began to settle over the floodplain. The dew had vanished. Mud in open places started to dry on the surface, while beneath the trees it still held its softness. The sound of insects grew thicker, stretching like a veil of sound over the low forest. This was not a good time to travel far. The Ankylosaurus left the water's edge and chose a shaded place on slightly higher ground, where a few low trunks blocked part of the sun, then began to lower its body. A heavy body has to lie down carefully. The legs folded, the belly lowered, little by little. The back held its balance. The tail shifted to one side and rested on the ground like a solid piece of wood. There was no heavy collapse, no haste. Everything happened slowly with control, like every other movement in this animal's life. Once it had settled, the armored back almost blended with the color of earth and shadow. From far away, the creature might have been mistaken for a large mound of mud covered in dry leaves. Midday was a time for rest. Not the deep sleep of a place completely safe, but the broken rest of a creature that always belonged to the wild. The eyes might close for a while, then open when a sound changed. The head might lift if the wind brought an unfamiliar scent, then lower again when the forest returned to its familiar rhythm. Inside the body, the plants eaten in the morning were being digested, slowly turning into energy for a frame that was becoming stronger, more solid, and harder to move. In this quiet interval, we can see the real life of Ankylosaurus more clearly. It was not always confrontation. It was not always tail swings or predators lurking at the edge of the forest. Most of the time, life was simply eating, resting, drinking water, choosing a path, avoiding deep mud, listening to the wind, and not placing itself in unnecessary danger. An armored animal does not always need to prove its strength. Sometimes strength is simply the ability to keep a steady rhythm of life in a world filled with too many surprises. Afternoon came slowly. The light turned golden and soft, sliding over the low trunks and falling across the mud in long streaks. The Ankylosaurus began to rise. The head lifted first, the front legs pressed down. The heavy body pushed away from the ground, and the tail dragged behind. A little dried mud flaked from the belly and legs. The armored creature stood still for a few moments to regain its balance, then slowly moved toward another patch of low vegetation, where afternoon often left a little moisture in the leaves. Along the way, many traces of a living day appeared across the ground. There were fresh tracks from larger plant eaters, There were places where mud had been churned around a rotting trunk. There were small marks crossing the water's edge. There were crushed branches and leaves showing that some creature had passed through not long before. The Ankylosaurus did not stop at every sign, but the body still recorded them. For a species that lived slowly, the ground was like an open notebook. Mud scent and broken leaves could say things the eyes had not yet seen. The evening meal was quieter than the morning meal. The air cooled gradually. Leaves after a day of sunlight carried a different scent, less dewy, but still soft in their youngest parts. The broad head lowered, the jaw chewed slowly. The heavy body stepped forward a little, then stopped again. The tail brushed through low grass, causing a few grains of dried mud to fall. Small insects rose into the air, circled around the armored back, then settled again, as though that massive body were simply another part of the forest. At times, a deep sound came from far away. The Ankylosaurus stopped. It did not panic, and it did not run. It only stood still in the evening shadow. Body turned toward the wind, head low, tail resting behind like a silent weight. The sound could have been a large creature passing through. It could have been a branch breaking. It could have been nothing more than mud slipping near the water's edge. After a while, the forest remained normal. The insects did not stop. The wind carried no new scent of danger. The meal continued. This was how the creature lived. It did not ignore signals, but it did not spend energy on fear when danger had not come close. That low, broad body was not made for long runs. Energy had to be saved for more important things, standing firm, eating enough, avoiding bad ground, and reacting strongly only when truly necessary. As the sun lowered, the Ankylosaurus began to search for a place to spend the night. The water's edge was not a good choice because the mud was soft and many creatures passed through. A wide open clearing was not a good choice either, even if lying down there might have been easier. Better was a low patch of vegetation where the ground sat slightly higher, roots held the mud more firmly, and the shade was thick enough to make the heavy body less visible in the night. The resting place was not a den, and it was not a nest. It was only a somewhat enclosed space among low plants and fallen leaves. But for a creature that had learned to live slowly, that was enough. The Ankylosaurus stood there for a while, listening one last time before night came down. Then the heavy body slowly lowered itself. The earth received that weight. Dry leaves shifted softly beneath the belly. The tail curved behind, while the armored back faced upward like a low dome in the dark. When night arrived, the forest changed its voice. Daytime sounds faded down, and the smaller noises of night began to rise. Somewhere far away, water still flowed. Insects called steadily. Wind moved through the low branches, carrying the smell of mud leaves and creatures that had passed through and disappeared. The Ankylosaurus lay still, breathing slowly. A day closed not with a great victory, not with a memorable clash, but with something far simpler enough. Food had been eaten, water had been found, unsafe places had been avoided, and a resting place had been chosen before the darkness grew thick. Perhaps that is the true beauty of Ankylosaurus's life. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is being able to live slowly in a dangerous world. It is lowering the head to eat, at dawn crossing mud without becoming trapped, resting beneath the trees when the sun is too hot, then continuing onward when evening comes. It is surviving through many ordinary days until those ordinary days build a durable body In the darkness, at the end of the day, the armored creature lay still beneath the low trees. Its heavy, even breathing blended into the rhythm of the ancient night. There were no thoughts of the past, no vision of the future, no awareness that tens of millions of years later, humans would look at fossils and imagine that low, broad body, that rugged armor, and that heavy tail. For the Ankylosaurus today was only another day that had passed. A day with dawn, with mud, with silent meals, and in the slow rhythm of a land 70 million years ago, that living fortress continued to exist without noise, without hurry, quietly carrying its heavy body through the low forest like a lasting part of the ancient earth. There comes a moment in the life of Ankylosaurus when the body is no longer only a vessel for life. That body has become a wall, a warning, a boundary that others must think very carefully about before crossing. After many seasons spent moving through mud-low forests and damp riverbanks, the young Ankylosaurus of earlier days had become a mature creature. Its body was low and broad, heavy, like a mound of earth that could breathe. Its back was covered with rugged plates of bony armor, not shining, not beautiful, but solid and rough like ancient stone. Its head was low and wide, its neck thick, its snout still lowered toward the ground in search of soft leaves. Its 4 legs were short but steady, carrying that heavy body through the mud with the patience of a species not born to run. And behind it, the tail was no longer just a quiet part of the body dragging along the ground. The end of the tail had become heavy and solid, shaped by time into a living club. When that tail shifted low, grass was pushed aside. When it swept through the mud, the ground was left with a long, deep, slow mark. When it swung with force, it was no longer a harmless movement. It was something that could break bone, make predators step back, and turn an attack that seemed easy into a final mistake. Most of the time, Ankylosaurus was still a quiet plant eater. In the morning, it lowered its head among low plants. At noon, it rested in the shade. In the afternoon, it moved along the water's edge in search of more soft leaves. The strength of this animal did not lie in attacking first, but in making others unwilling to try. In nature, some battles end before they even begin, simply because one side understands that the price would be too high. The first enemies of a full-grown Ankylosaurus were not always giant beasts. Sometimes they were smaller, faster opportunists used to watching from the forest edge and testing anything that seemed weak, wounded, or unaware. One damp afternoon after rain, while the sun still hung low behind the trees, the armored fortress was feeding near a patch of open ground. The mud was still soft. The air smelled of crushed leaves and river water. Tiny insects lifted into the air each time the broad snout pulled through the low vegetation. From behind a fallen trunk, a few small shadows slipped past very quickly. They were not large, not strong enough to bring down an adult with a single attack, but quick enough to try biting at soft places, bold enough to harass, and hungry enough to search for an opening. They did not rush in at once. They circled, kept their distance, sometimes vanishing behind bushes, and then appearing again from another angle. That is how smaller predators often test the world, not with courage, but with patience, waiting for a chance. Ankylosaurus stopped feeding. There was no roar. There was no panic. The low head lifted only slightly, just enough to feel the wind. The heavy body turned slowly, placing the broad armored back toward the movement in the brush. The tail dragged through the mud, leaving a dark mark behind it. The small shadows stopped. One moved a little closer, then stepped back. Another circled toward the flank, searching for a better angle. The living fortress only turned a little more. The movement was slow but clear. It was not a loud threat, but an arrangement of the body armored back above low head in front, heavy tail behind, and almost no easy place along the sides to approach. The small predators needed an opening, but in front of them was a creature that offered none. A hurried bite into the armor would only waste energy. One step too close to the tail could end the entire gamble with broken bone and a cry of pain. The tail swung once. It did not need to hit. The sweep cut across the low grass, flinging up mud, throwing dry leaves into the air, and making a small trunk shake hard before it broke. The small shadows scattered immediately. They did not die. They were not crushed. No real battle needed to happen. Simply seeing the force of that swing changed every calculation inside the predators' minds. Meat may have been tempting, but not tempting enough to trade for a broken leg. A few moments later, the forest returned to normal. Insects continued their calls. Wind moved through the leaves. Ankylosaurus lowered its head and began to feed again, as though what had just happened were only a stronger gust of wind than usual. But from that moment on, the open patch of ground belonged once more to the armored creature. Not because it had chased anything down, not because it had killed anything, but because that body was too difficult to touch without paying a price. But in the world of the late Cretaceous, not every enemy was small. There were footprints in the mud that could change the feeling of the entire forest. Deep, long, three-toed tracks with the claw marks pressed clearly into the front. The footprints of a large predator. A creature that did not need to slip through low bushes, did not need to test its luck with a small piece of food, and did not need to fear most prey in this land. Where Ankylosaurus lived, the largest shadow belonged to Tyrannosaurus. There is no need to imagine Tyrannosaurus as a monster roaring at every moment. A large predator also had to live by calculation. Every run cost energy. Every wound could mean many days of lost hunting. A powerful bite could bring down many creatures, but if the target was armored low to the ground and carried a heavy tail club, the meal was no longer simple. One late afternoon, when the light had turned the color of old bronze Ankylosaurus moved across a muddy flat near the forest edge. This was a place with many low plants and a few patches of tender leaves that had grown after rain. Not far away, the ground opened into a broad path leading down toward water. Across the mud were large, fresh footprints. Their edges had not yet collapsed. Water had not yet filled them. The scent in the wind was heavier, drier, different from mud and leaves. The living fortress stopped. From beyond the low line of trees, a large body stepped out. There was no need for haste, no need to run. A single step was enough to press the mud deeply down. The large head-heavy jaws and eyes turned toward the armored creature, standing between the edge of light and the edge of shadow. There was no dramatic music in the real world, only wind, the smell of water, the sound of insects thinning out, and a very clear silence as two creatures became aware of one another. Tyrannosaurus did not charge at once. That is important. In nature, the predator that lives long is not the one that attacks everything in front of it. A healthy prey animal, low armored and standing firmly, is not like a carcass, not like a hatchling, and not like a wounded creature. The adult Ankylosaurus did not run. The heavy body only turned slowly, placing the rear of itself toward the danger, lowering its head, and keeping all 4 feet planted firmly in the mud. The distance between the two creatures narrowed slightly. Tyrannosaurus stepped to the side, looking for an angle. The enormous head tilted a little, as if measuring the position of the neck, flank, legs, and tail. But Ankylosaurus did not reveal much. The back was a low roof of armor. The sides were broad and hard. The softer belly was kept close to the ground. The heavy tail lay behind, but it was not asleep. Each time the predator changed direction, that tail shifted as well, slow, firm, and deliberate. One more step. Mud stirred beneath the feet of Tyrannosaurus. Insects lifted from the ground. Ankylosaurus turned its hips, keeping the tail club between itself and the predator. There was no answering roar, no display of anger in the way humans often imagine. Only a low body, a layer of armor, and a weapon at the end of the tail, waiting for the right distance. Tyrannosaurus tried to move closer from the side. The first swing from Ankylosaurus did not need to be graceful. A heavy body turned through the mud, the muscles of the back and hips pulling the tail in a wide arc. The club swept through the air, low and powerful, carrying with it the sound of mud being torn from the ground. The predator stepped back in time, but the distance had been made clear. If one foot were placed wrong, if the lower leg took the full force of the strike, the hunt could end in an injury that even a powerful predator would not want to carry. Neither side won immediately, and neither side wanted to pay the price too soon. Tyrannosaurus circled again. Ankylosaurus turned with it slower, but enough. That slowness was not weakness. It was the strategy of a body built to hold its ground. The low legs kept the center of gravity stable. The broad body was hard to push off balance. The armored back made a bite from above less tempting. The tail club meant the rear was no longer a blind spot easy to exploit. If the predator wanted to win, it would have to find a way to flip, drag bite somewhere unprotected, or wait for a mistake. But Ankylosaurus offered very few mistakes. The living fortress did not advance. It did not chase. It did not show off. It only held distance and forced its opponent to keep calculating. A long while passed in a very slow way. The afternoon light dropped lower. The mud grew colder. The wind changed direction. Tyrannosaurus stopped, head still facing the prey, but the feet no longer moving forward. Perhaps the hunger was still there. Perhaps the chance was still being weighed. But the opportunity was not clear enough, and the cost was too real. At last, the predator turned away, not because it was afraid in a simple way, not because Ankylosaurus was stronger in every situation, but because in that moment, the meal was not worth the risk. A badly injured predator could lose the ability to hunt for many days. A painful leg, a cracked bone, one blow landing in the right place could turn the ruler of the land into a starving animal. And in nature, sometimes the wisest decision for survival is to walk away from prey that is too expensive. Ankylosaurus remained still until the large shadow disappeared beyond the trees. Only when the forest began to breathe again did the armored fortress lower its head. But the meal did not continue at once. The heavy body stood there for a while longer, the tail still behind it, mud clinging to the club, its breathing slow but deep. The encounter had left almost no wound, but that did not make it unimportant. It was the quietest kind of victory, surviving without spilling blood. And yet the enemies of Ankylosaurus did not come only from outside its own kind. A mature creature could also encounter another armored individual. Not every meeting between members of the same species is peaceful. A place with good food, a safe path down to water, a cool patch of shade during a hot season, all of these have value. And when two heavy bodies both want to hold the same ground, silence can become tighter than any roar. One dry morning, near a strip of low plants where young leaves grew thickly, Ankylosaurus met another individual. Neither rushed in. The two living fortresses stood apart, heads low, bodies broad, heavy tails placed behind them. There were no bright colors, no beautiful dance, only mud heat, the sound of insects, and two bodies built to endure. One individual stepped forward. The other did not move back immediately. Tails shifted. Mud was dragged into curved marks. The distance shortened little by little. Then a low sweep sounded, not meant to kill, but to warn. Mud flew upward. Low grass flattened. The opposing body turned aside and answered with another heavy movement. The two creatures did not fight like predators. They did not bite and tear in order to eat flesh. Their collision was more like two ancient masses of earth testing which one would give way. After several changes in direction, one side stopped for a little longer. The head lowered. The tail lay still. Then that individual turned away slowly, leaving the patch of soft plants. There was no winner in a loud sense. No loser in a tragic sense. Only order rearranged in silence. With creatures like these, sometimes simply proving that the body is strong enough, heavy enough, and dangerous enough is enough for the battle to end. But every fortress has its limits. Ankylosaurus was not immortal. Armor did not protect every part of the body. The belly was still softer. The legs could still be injured. Deep mud could still trap a body that was too heavy. Drought could make low plants grow sparse. Floods could turn a familiar path into dangerous water. A small wound, if infected, could still slow the feet. The seeming invulnerability of Ankylosaurus was not magic. It was a harsh agreement with the world. Come closer if you dare to pay the price. And most enemies understood that. Day after day, the armored creature continued to move through its land. Its footprints were deeper, slower, more certain. Smaller predators kept away if they saw no clear opportunity. Larger predators watched longer before deciding. Members of its own kind might test it, then withdraw when the distance became too dangerous. Even the wind, mud, and shade seemed to know how to wrap around that low, broad body, turning Ankylosaurus into a solid part of the ancient floodplain. Evening settled over the forest. The last light of day moved across the rugged plates of armor, touching dried mud, small scratches, and the heavy tail resting behind. The marks on that body did not tell the story of a hunter. They told the story of a creature that had been tested many times and still remained there. A bite abandoned, a failed circling. A rival of its own kind turning away. A muddy season endured. One more day undefeated. When darkness fell, Ankylosaurus found a resting place beneath the low trees. The heavy body lowered itself slowly to the ground. The armored back faced upward like a low roof of stone. The tail rested behind it, silent but full of meaning. In the night, a predator could still be moving somewhere out there. Three-toed footprints could still be pressed into the mud before dawn. Hungry eyes could still look from the forest edge. But not all prey is the same. Some prey runs, some prey hides. But Ankylosaurus lay there like a fortress. It did not need to guard itself with roars. It did not need to drive anything out of the darkness. It only needed to exist with armor on its back, a body low as though fastened to the earth, and a tail club heavy enough to turn any attack into a gamble. In the world of the late Cretaceous, where teeth, claws, and hunger always moved through the low forest, that fortress was not truly impenetrable in an absolute sense. But for predators searching for an easy meal, Ankylosaurus was nearly the worst choice they could make. And so, among mud shadow and dangerous footprints, the armored creature continued to live. Not through speed, not through aggression, but through a very simple message written across every plate of armor, every heavy step, and every silent swing of its tail. Come closer if you are willing to pay the price. No creature knows it is living in the final days of an age. On the floodplains of the late Cretaceous, morning still arrived like every other morning. Dew still rested on the leaves. The mud was still cold beneath the trees. Streams of water still moved slowly through the roots, carrying fallen leaves, dry branches, and cloudy silt. Insects still called from the low brush. Plant eaters still followed familiar paths in search of food. And in the midst of that world, Ankylosaurus continued to live in the way that had carried this animal through so many seasons, slowly, heavily, silently. There was no sign in the sky to tell the armored creature that the history of Earth was about to change direction. No warning cry passed through the low forest. No instinct was powerful enough to understand an event arriving from distant space. For Ankylosaurus, the world was still measured by things close at hand: the smell of damp mud, the taste of soft leaves, the firmness of the ground beneath its feet, sounds in the brush, fresh footprints at the water's edge, and the safe distance between its heavy body and the predators that might be moving somewhere out there. That living fortress had reached adulthood. Its back was covered in rugged, bony armor, its body low and broad, its 4 legs firm like short posts driven into the ground. The tail club behind it did not need to swing often to remind the world of its danger. Simply resting there, heavy and silent, that tail was enough to turn every attack into a difficult calculation. Across many seasons, that body had learned how to keep danger at a distance. Smaller predators stayed away if there was no clear opportunity. Larger predators had to think carefully before coming too close. Others of its own kind might test it, then leave when the confrontation no longer seemed worth the cost. But time always follows its own direction. Ankylosaurus could stand against teeth and claws. Its armor could make a bite nearly useless. Its tail could force a predator to step back. Its low body close to the earth could help it hold its ground against many threats. But no armor was made to resist the changing of an entire planet. No clubbed tail could strike away the darkness if one day the sky became covered. No creature, however strong within its own world, could stand outside the deep history of Earth. On some afternoon, perhaps one very much like all the afternoons before it, Ankylosaurus stepped slowly along the edge of the low forest. Light fell at an angle across its armored back, touching dried mud, small scratches, and each plate of bone hidden beneath the skin. The ground was still soft after rain. Far away, a herd of plant eaters moved near the water, leaving deep tracks behind. The wind carried the smell of crushed leaves, silt, and the bodies of creatures that had passed through. Ankylosaurus lowered its head, pulled at soft leaves growing close to the mud, and chewed slowly as it had done on countless days before. If we stood beside that scene, everything might have seemed peaceful. There was no battle, no roar, no predator appearing at the edge of the trees. Only an ancient creature feeding in the afternoon light, doing the simplest thing life has always done, continuing. It is precisely that ordinariness that makes the moment feel sadder when we look back from the future. Because in the final days of the Cretaceous, many creatures still lived as though tomorrow were certain to come. Then an event too vast for any instinct began to enter the story of Earth. We do not need to imagine that this Ankylosaurus saw everything. We do not need to place the creature directly beneath a burning sky. We do not need to turn one individual into the exact witness of something fossils cannot fully tell. What matters more is understanding that at the end of the Cretaceous, a gigantic event changed the world of creatures like Ankylosaurus. The sky, the climate, the food, the forests, the rivers, the shorelines. Everything entered a chain of upheavals that no armor could stop. Before that catastrophe arrived, life still had its own rhythm. Ankylosaurus still moved among the paths through low vegetation, still avoided deep mud, still drank at the edges of cloudy pools, still chose shade when the sun climbed too high. Somewhere a Tyrannosaurus may still have been following the scent of flesh or carrion. A Triceratops may still have been lowering its head near a patch of low plants. Small mammals still ran through the layer of fallen leaves. Insects still clung to tree trunks. All of these creatures belonged to a world that seemed enduring, but in truth was standing very close to the edge of an ending. When the environment began to change, danger no longer resembled the familiar enemies. A predator could be seen. Footprints could be recognized in the mud. An unfamiliar scent could make the body stop. But a changing climate did not leave clear footprints at first. Fewer plants did not roar before they disappeared. A darker sky had no shape of an enemy for Ankylosaurus to turn its tail toward. This was a quieter kind of danger, wider not coming from a jaw or a claw, but from the entire world changing around the body. If food became scarcer, a heavy plant eater would feel it first through longer journeys. Soft bushes were no longer as thick as before. Places that once grew new shoots after rain now offered fewer. Familiar feeding grounds became more open and bare. If water changed, old paths down to the riverbank might no longer be safe. If the forest weakened, there would be less shade. Each single change might seem small, but together they made the slow life of Ankylosaurus more difficult. The living fortress could still hold its ground against a predator, but before a world that was losing food, every kind of strength became something different. We can imagine a late day in the life of that creature, when the armored body moved through a land that had once been greener. Dry mud cracked beneath its feet. A few low bushes still held leaves, but not many. The broad head lowered for longer, searching for soft parts that could still be eaten. The heavy tail dragged behind, leaving a slow mark across the ground. The body remained strong, remained solid, remained frightening to anything that wished to attack it directly. But that strength could not make leaves grow faster, could not call the rain back, could not stop difficult seasons from drawing near. That is the quietest point in the story of Ankylosaurus, not the confrontation with Tyrannosaurus, not the tail swinging through mud, not the armor that made predators step back, but the truth that a creature could be almost perfectly equipped by nature to survive the ordinary world and still be unable to escape an event larger than anything its body had ever been prepared for. Eventually, some Ankylosaurus fell, perhaps not in battle, perhaps not beneath the jaws of a predator, perhaps because of age, lack of food, sickness, injury, mud, drought, flood, or a chain of small things gathered together. Fossils usually do not tell us the full truth of a final moment. Stone may preserve bones, but it rarely preserves the last breath, the last light, or the final sound a creature heard. So we do not need to speak with certainty about what no one can know. We can only stand before that silence and imagine gently. The heavy body lay down somewhere on the ancient floodplain. Leaves fell over the armor. Mud rose around the bones. Water may have passed after a rainstorm carrying fine sand and silt. Over time, the soft parts disappeared first. Skin, muscle, eyes, breath all returned to the earth, but the harder parts remained longer. Bones, teeth, armor plates, the heavy end of the tail, the final signs of a body that had once lived. Then the world covered that creature layer by layer, a layer of mud, a layer of sand, a season of flooding, a season of dryness. Roots, new earth, new sediment, years, thousands of years, millions of years. Rivers changed course, forests vanished, continents shifted, climate moved through long cycles that no creature from the old story could still feel. Above, new worlds continued to grow and fade. Below, in the darkness of stone, what remained of Ankylosaurus lay still. It was a very long silence. Not one night, not one season, not the time of human memory. but tens of millions of years long enough for mountains to wear down seas, to retreat forests to become plains, and creatures that had never existed in the time of Ankylosaurus to appear, evolve, and vanish. Through all that time, the living fortress no longer stepped through mud, no longer lowered its head to feed, no longer turned its tail toward a predator. But the body that had once been built to withstand still left traces behind, and those traces waited inside the earth like a story not yet read. Then very late in the history of Earth, humans appeared, not the first humans seeing Ankylosaurus with living eyes. That never happened. Between us and that armored creature lies an ocean of time too vast to cross. But humans learned how to read stone, how to read bone, how to read the fragments left behind in layers of sediment. A skull, a plate of armor, a section of tail, a vertebra. Things that seemed separate and broken became clues for rebuilding the shadow of a creature that had disappeared before human beings ever existed. When a piece of fossil is lifted out of stone, the silence of 70 million years begins to speak, not with sound, not with a roar returning from the past, but with the language of shape, of structure, of thick bone, of rugged armor, of a tail made for defense. Paleontologists look at those remains and begin to ask, how did this creature live? What did it eat? How did it move? How did it defend itself against enemies? Why was its body so low and broad? Why did its armor develop in that direction? And how great would the cost have been for anything that tried to attack it? From those questions, Ankylosaurus returns to human imagination, not as an animal alive with flesh and breath, but as a shadow rebuilt from evidence. In museums, people see the broad skull, the armor plates, the reconstructed shape of the low body, the heavy clubbed tail behind it. Children stand before that model and think of a dinosaur like a tank. Adults who look longer may feel something else. This creature is not only remarkable because of its powerful appearance, but because its entire body is a story of how life protects itself. What remains after 70 million years is not only bone. What remains is a lesson about slowness, about a plant eater that did not need to rule through speed, about a body built to endure more than to attack, about ordinary days, silent meals, moments of avoiding deep mud, moments of standing still before the footprints of predators. What remains is the image of a creature that did not live to become a legend, but became one anyway, simply because it existed in such a particular way. Ankylosaurus reminds us that strength is not always loud. There is the strength of jaws, the strength of claws, the strength of speed. But there is also the strength of endurance, of being able to stand firm, of not being forced to run when danger comes near. In a world that often praises predators, Ankylosaurus represents another way of existing. Quiet, defensive, slow, but not easily broken. And perhaps that is why the image of this armored creature stays with us. Because everyone understands in some way the feeling of wanting to have armor, wanting a safe place inside one's own body, wanting the ability to move through a noisy world without being shattered. Ankylosaurus knew nothing of those meanings. The ancient animal only lived, ate, breathed, walked through mud, avoided danger, and continued to exist. But looking back from the present, humans can find in that shape a very simple symbol. Sometimes survival itself is already a victory large enough. Tonight, as the story draws near its close, imagine the floodplain of the late Cretaceous one final time. Dew rests on the leaves. Mud is soft beneath the feet. Murky water reflects the ancient sky. Far away, three-toed footprints press into the ground and vanish into shade. And among the low forest, Ankylosaurus moves slowly through the scene armor, across its back, heavy tail behind it, head lowered in search of soft leaves. No hurry, no display, no need to become a predator in order to be respected by the world. Then that image slowly fades. The ancient forest sinks beneath layers of time. Mud becomes stone. Bone becomes fossil. Breath disappears. Footprints are covered over. But the story is not completely lost. It only sleeps for a very long time in the earth, waiting for the day it will be found, cleaned from stone, placed beneath the light, and told again in the voices of those who came after. That is what remains after 70 million years of silence. A few pieces of bone, a layer of fossilized armor, a tale that was once a warning, and the memory of a living fortress that moved across the ancient earth, slowly, enduringly, silently, until its whole world disappeared while its traces remained behind. And here our journey tonight beside Ankylosaurus slowly comes to a close. From a small egg lying silent in the warm earth of the late Cretaceous, we have followed that creature through its first uncertain steps. We have watched it grow among mud, low forests, and predator footprints pressed deep into the ancient ground. We have listened to the slow rhythm of a plant eater that did not need to display its strength, but simply ate in silence, moved onward, rested, and survived. Then, as the years passed, its body became something nature rarely creates: a fortress that could breathe. An armored back, a low, solid frame, a heavy tail like a final warning to anything that came too close. Ankylosaurus did not need to roar in order to be feared. It only needed to stand there silent in the ancient afternoon light and let the world understand that some creatures survive not through speed, not through claws, but through a kind of endurance so deep it leaves us still. But in the end, no matter how hard the armor, no creature can stand outside the history of Earth. The age of dinosaurs, too, moved toward its twilight. Forests vanished. Rivers changed their course. Footprints were buried beneath stone, waiting for humans tens of millions of years later to find them again, like fragments of memory from a lost world. If you enjoy slow journeys like this one, please subscribe to the channel, follow the fan page, and leave me a comment telling me on our next journey which ancient creature would you like to hear about. T-Rex, Triceratops, Spinosaurus, Megalodon, or a predator that disappeared into the darkness of prehistory. And now I wish you a truly peaceful night. Let the image of Ankylosaurus keep moving slowly through the ancient forest, carrying an entire fortress upon its back, and fading gradually into the mist of 70 million years ago.